Picture a child standing in a crowded room, sensing, before any word is spoken, exactly which version of themselves earns a smile and which version earns silence. That child learns fast. Too fast. Within a few years, the mask isn't something worn on occasion anymore. It becomes the default setting, the operating system running quietly underneath every interaction. Carl Jung called this construction the persona, borrowed straight from the Latin word for the masks actors wore in ancient theatre. And like any mask, it was never meant to be the face. It was meant to be a costume for a single scene, not a permanent skin grafted onto the soul. Here's the trap nobody warns you about. The persona that once saved you eventually starts running the show. What began as a survival strategy, staying agreeable to avoid a parent's anger, staying small to avoid a sibling's jealousy, staying impressive to earn a teacher's approval, calcifies into identity. People stop asking, "Who am I?" and start asking, "What do they need me to be right now?" The tragedy isn't that the mask exists. Masks are useful, even necessary, for navigating a world full of strangers. The tragedy is forgetting it's removable. Ask anyone exhausted by their own life, and dig past the surface complaints, the job, the relationship, the schedule, and you'll usually find the same root. A person who has been performing a character for so long, they've lost the script for their own lines. Watch how this plays out practically. A man spends 15 years being the reliable one at work, always available, always accommodating, always the first to say yes. Promotions come, compliments come, respect comes. But something quieter erodes underneath all that approval, the part of him that actually wanted to say no, that wanted rest, that had opinions worth defending. By year 16, he doesn't recognize the face in the mirror. This is the mechanism Jung warned about, identification with the persona, where the costume fuses to the skin and the wearer forgets a person exists underneath it. Marcus Aurelius wrote his private reflections precisely to counter this same erosion, reminding himself, alone, away from any audience, what he actually believed, separate from what Rome expected him to perform. That practice, writing without an audience, speaking truth where no one is grading the performance, remains one of the fastest ways to locate the difference between who you are and who you've been cast as. So the real question worth sitting with isn't whether you wear a mask. Everyone does, every day, in every room. The real question is whether you still remember it's a mask, because somewhere underneath the performance, the smile calibrated for approval, the opinions softened for comfort, the silence chosen for peace, something older and quieter has been waiting this whole time. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's just been politely standing in the corner, watching the show, waiting for someone to finally turn around and look. Here's something that will rearrange how you see every conflict you've ever had. Most people aren't reacting to you. They're reacting to a hologram their own mind built, using you as the screen it gets projected onto. Jung called this mechanism projection, and it might be the single most underestimated force shaping human relationships. The unresolved anger someone carries from a parent who never apologized, that finds a new target the moment a friend hesitates before responding to a text. The insecurity someone buried about their own intelligence, that finds release the instant a coworker disagrees with them in a meeting. None of it is really about you. You just happen to stand in the path of something old, something already loaded, something that was always going to fire eventually. Think about the friend who explodes over a minor inconvenience, a late arrival, a forgotten reply, a joke landing wrong, and the intensity of the reaction feels wildly disproportionate to the event itself. That disproportion is the clue. When the emotional response outweighs the actual offense, something else is happening underneath the surface. A complex has been activated, an old wound has been touched, and the present moment becomes a stage for a much older drama. Viktor Frankl, observed something similar from inside the concentration camps he survived. The people who suffered most weren't always those facing the worst external conditions, but those whose internal world had no anchor separate from what was happening to them. Projection works the same way. It collapses the gap between what's happening and what I believe about myself until the two become indistinguishable. This explains a pattern that confuses almost everyone at some point, being hated by someone who barely knows you. It feels irrational because it is, rationally, but it's not random. Somewhere, you triggered a projection. Maybe your confidence reminded someone of the confidence they buried to stay safe. Maybe your boundaries reminded someone of the boundaries they never learnt to hold. People rarely resent what's foreign to them. They resent what's familiar, the parts of themselves they exiled, suddenly walking around in someone else's body, unapologetic and free. A practical move here: the next time someone's reaction feels wildly out of proportion to what actually happened, resist the urge to defend yourself immediately. Pause, ask, quietly inside, is this about what I did, or about something this person has been carrying long before I arrived? Lao Tzu wrote that the wise don't move to be understood by others, they move in alignment with what's true, and let understanding arrive or not, as it will. That's not passivity. That's precision, because once you see projection clearly, defending yourself against it stops making sense. You can't argue someone out of a hologram their own unconscious built. What you can do is notice the moment it's happening, refuse to absorb it as truth about who you are, and let the conversation that follows happen on cleaner ground. Every long-term relationship, friendship, marriage, family, partnership, runs on an agreement nobody ever speaks out loud, yet everybody somehow signs. The terms go something like this: I'll keep being who you've come to expect, if you keep being who I've come to expect. No lawyer drafts it, no conversation names it. But the moment one person changes, gets healthier, gets quieter, gets less available for old patterns, the other party often reacts as though a real contract has been violated. Because, on some unconscious level, it has. Psychologists who study family systems call this homeostasis, the unspoken pressure every system exerts to keep its members playing their assigned roles, even when those roles were never healthy to begin with. Consider the dynamic between two old friends, where one has always played the listener and the other has always played the talker. For years, it works. Each person gets something from the arrangement. Then, the listener starts setting boundaries, starts bringing their own problems to the table, starts taking up space they never used to claim. Watch what happens. Often, instead of celebration, there's friction. The talker feels confused, even betrayed, without fully understanding why. That confusion is the invisible contract being broken in real time. The system rewarded a specific configuration, and any change to that configuration, even growth, even health, registers as a threat to the equilibrium everyone got used to. This is precisely why some of the loneliest moments in life happen not during isolation, but during transformation, surrounded by the very people who are supposed to know you best. A woman who spends a decade as the strong one in her family, the one who never falls apart, the one everyone leans on, eventually hits a season where she needs to lean on someone else for once. And the family, trained for years to expect strength from her, doesn't know how to receive anything else. They built their whole structure around her steadiness. So when she finally shows a crack, it doesn't get met with support. It gets met with discomfort, sometimes denial, sometimes the subtle suggestion that she go back to being herself, as if her exhaustion were the malfunction rather than an honest signal. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, in the quietest hours of his reign, that other people's disapproval of his choices was never proof those choices were wrong, only proof that something in him had shifted beyond what they were prepared to accept. The invisible contract only holds power over you as long as you believe maintaining it is your responsibility. The moment you stop performing your assigned role just to keep someone else comfortable, you find out fairly quickly who actually valued you and who only valued the function you served. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when someone finally changes. Not the comfortable silence of agreement, but the tense, searching silence of people recalculating who they're now dealing with. Personal transformation, the thing self-help books promise will make life better, often gets received by the people closest to us not as good news, but as a quiet act of abandonment. Jung wrote about individuation, becoming who you actually are, beneath every adaptation made for survival, as a journey that almost always costs something, not because growth is wrong. Because growth changes the terms everyone else built their comfort around, and comfort, once disturbed, rarely responds with gratitude. Watch what happens to someone who finally leaves a toxic job after years of complaining about it to friends. You'd expect celebration. Sometimes you get it. But often, underneath the congratulations, there's a strange tension. Friends who built part of their own identity around "we're both stuck here together" suddenly facing a mirror they didn't ask for. The friend who left becomes a quiet accusation. If she could change her situation, why haven't I changed mine? That discomfort rarely gets spoken honestly. Instead, it shows up as distance. Fewer calls, half-hearted enthusiasm, a subtle pulling away dressed up as we've just been busy. Bessel van der Kolk, writing about trauma and the body, observed that people often resist healing not because they don't want relief, but because the people around them have organized their entire sense of normal around the wound, staying exactly where it is. This is the part almost nobody prepares you for. The better you get, the more some relationships will quietly strain under the weight of it. A man who stops drinking to numb stress discovers, painfully, that several of his closest friendships were built almost entirely on shared numbing, and without the substance, there's suddenly very little left to talk about. A woman who finally starts charging what her work is worth finds that family members who once praised her humility now call her different, as if confidence were a character flaw newly acquired rather than a strength finally claimed. None of this means the change was wrong. It usually means the change was real enough to disturb a system that depended on the old version staying intact. Marcus Aurelius wrote that he answered to his own conscience, not to the expectations others projected onto him, because external approval, he understood, was never a reliable compass for internal truth. If growth feels lonely right now, that loneliness isn't evidence you took a wrong turn. More often, it's evidence the people around you haven't caught up yet. And some of them never will, not because they can't, but because catching up would require admitting they could change too. And not everyone is ready to look at that mirror. Somewhere around age 6 or 7, every human being starts a quiet, lifelong project, building a personality acceptable enough to keep love coming. Anger gets tucked away because it scared the adults. Ambition gets buried because it made a sibling jealous. Sensitivity gets hidden because it got mocked once, just once, and that was enough. Jung called everything exiled in this process the shadow, not evil, not monstrous, simply unlived. And here's the part that catches most people off guard. None of it actually disappears. It goes underground, waits, and accumulates interest like a debt nobody remembers borrowing. This is why the explosion never matches the trigger. A man who prided himself on being endlessly patient suddenly snaps at his children over something trivial, a spilled drink, a forgotten chore, and the rage that comes out feels disconnected from its cause, almost foreign. Like it belongs to someone else entirely. It does, in a sense. It belongs to the version of him that was never allowed to be angry as a child, the one who learned early that frustration meant punishment, so he buried it instead of expressing it. Decades later, that buried frustration doesn't ask permission. It just surfaces, usually at the worst possible moment, aimed at whoever happens to be standing closest. Frankl wrote that what we don't process, we're forced to repeat, not as memory, but as compulsion, dressed up as something happening for the first time. A useful practice here: the next time an emotional reaction feels bigger than the situation deserves, get curious instead of ashamed. Ask what this moment is actually touching, not what it's about on the surface, but what it might be standing in for underneath. Journaling helps here, specifically writing without editing, without trying to sound reasonable, just letting the unfiltered reaction hit the page. Jung himself did exactly this for years, recording dreams and unfiltered reactions in what later became known as the Red Book. Not to publish it, not to be understood by anyone, but to finally meet the parts of himself he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. The shadow isn't your enemy, even though it often gets framed that way in spiritual circles obsessed with only positive energy. The shadow is simply the unlived life. Every desire postponed, every anger swallowed, every grief never fully felt, all of it still very much alive, still very much yours, still waiting in a room you've avoided opening for years. Avoiding that room doesn't make it empty. It just makes the door harder to find when you finally need to walk through it. Pay attention to the moment right after someone misunderstands you, and notice the urge that rises almost instantly, the need to clarify, to add context, to make sure they see it the way you meant it. That urge feels harmless, even responsible. But chase it far enough back, and a different motive often surfaces underneath the good intentions, a fear that being misunderstood, even briefly, is somehow dangerous. Not socially awkward, dangerous. As if the gap between what I meant and what they heard might cost something irreplaceable, belonging, safety, love. That fear, more often than people realize, was installed early in homes where misunderstanding led to punishment, withdrawal, or chaos, and where being crystal clear became a survival skill rather than a communication preference. Here's the part worth sitting with. Every time you over-explain to manage someone else's perception of you, you quietly hand them something valuable: power over your internal state. Watch how this plays out with a person who can't end a conversation without making sure the other party isn't upset. They'll re-explain a simple decision 4 different ways. They'll soften a boundary until it's barely a boundary anymore. They'll apologize for things that needed no apology. From the outside, this looks like kindness. From the inside, it's often something closer to dependency, an emotional state that can't settle until someone else's face confirms it's safe to. Manipulative people learn this pattern fast, often faster than the person doing it learns it about themselves. They don't even need to argue, they just need to look mildly confused or slightly hurt. And the over-explainer will do the rest of the work, talking themselves in circles until they've abandoned their own position entirely. A practical shift here: the next time you feel the urge to add a 3rd or 4th explanation to something you've already said clearly once, pause and ask, am I clarifying or am I begging to be understood? Clarifying serves the conversation. Begging serves an old fear. One sentence said with calm conviction usually lands better than 5 sentences said with visible anxiety, because people read tone long before they read content, and anxious over-explaining signals underneath the words that you don't fully believe what you're saying either. Marcus Aurelius wrote that he no longer wasted energy imagining what others thought of him, choosing instead to focus solely on whether his own actions matched his own values, a discipline, not a personality trait, practiced daily like any other. Stoic philosophy across the board treats this distinction as foundational. Your reasoning, your effort, your integrity belong entirely to you. Other people's interpretation of those things never did. And chasing it endlessly is a battle that was lost before it started, because comprehension was never yours to control in the first place. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with being alone, and almost everything to do with being constantly seen, just never accurately. A person can be surrounded daily, a full calendar, a group chat that never goes quiet, a partner asleep beside them every night, and still carry a hollow, persistent ache that no amount of company seems to touch. That ache isn't loneliness in the traditional sense. It's something closer to invisibility, the slow erosion that happens when everyone around you knows the character you play, but almost nobody has met the one underneath it. This distinction matters more than it sounds. Being physically alone and being unseen are not the same experience, even though they produce a similar weight in the chest. A monk in silence for 30 years can feel more connected to existence than a man at a packed dinner table, laughing on cue, agreeing on cue, performing warmth he doesn't currently feel. The monk, at least, isn't performing. Eckhart Tolle wrote extensively about presence as the antidote here, not escaping people, but finally showing up as the one who's actually there, rather than the curated stand-in sent out to manage everyone else's comfort. Real presence, he argued, requires dropping the narrator, running constantly in the background, the one calculating how every word will land before it's even spoken. This is precisely why being loved for the mask can feel lonelier than not being loved at all. Picture a woman whose partner adores her, generous, attentive, affectionate, but whose adoration is aimed entirely at the version of her that never disagrees, never needs space, never has a bad day out loud. The affection is real. The target of it isn't. And living inside that gap, year after year, produces a specific kind of grief that's hard to name to anyone, because on paper, nothing looks wrong. She has love. She just doesn't have the kind that reaches the actual person underneath the performance, and that absence eventually starts to feel heavier than no love at all. Carl Jung wrote that loneliness doesn't come from having no people around, it comes from being unable to communicate the things that feel most important, and watching that gap widen with every smile that doesn't quite reach. Closing that gap rarely starts with finding new people. It usually starts with one honest sentence said out loud to someone willing to hear it. The kind of sentence that risks being misunderstood rather than the kind engineered to be safely agreeable. That single risk, small as it sounds, is often the first crack in a wall that's been holding for years. There's a turning point in this entire journey that Jung spent his life mapping, and he gave it a name that sounds clinical but describes something deeply human: individuation. Stripped of the jargon, it simply means this: becoming who you actually are, rather than who circumstance, family, and fear assembled for you. Most people spend the first half of life building an identity out of approval, what earned praise, what avoided punishment, what kept the peace. Individuation is the slow, often uncomfortable process of taking that identity apart, piece by piece, and asking which parts were ever truly chosen and which parts were simply inherited, like a coat handed down from someone else's closet. This process rarely announces itself with clarity. It usually starts as discomfort, a quiet, persistent sense that a life technically going well doesn't actually feel like yours. A woman with a stable career, a respected title, a life that looks complete on paper, finds herself sitting in her car some evenings, engine off, in no hurry to go inside, without fully understanding why. That hesitation is data. It's the self, quietly knocking from underneath decades of performance, asking to finally be let into the room. Jung believed symptoms like this, restlessness, low-grade dissatisfaction, the sense of playing a role even in your own home, were rarely random. They were the psyche's way of signaling that the persona had grown too small for what was actually alive underneath it. A practical entry point into this work. Start noticing the difference between decisions made from genuine desire and decisions made from anticipated reaction. Before agreeing to something, pause and ask, am I saying yes because I want this, or because I've already calculated what saying no would cost me socially? That single question, asked honestly and repeatedly over months, starts to reveal exactly how much of daily life has been built on management rather than choice. The Bhagavad Gita frames a similar idea through the concept of dharma, not duty imposed from outside, but the specific, non-transferable purpose only you were built to carry, distinct from what your family, your culture, or your fear ever assigned you. Individuation doesn't promise comfort. It promises something rarer, coherence. The relief of no longer managing two competing versions of yourself, the public one and the real one, finally collapsing into a single person who doesn't need a script before walking into a room. That collapse, when it finally happens, tends to feel less like becoming someone new and more like quietly recognizing someone who'd been standing there patiently the entire time, waiting to be let back in. Somewhere along the way, silence got a bad reputation. People started reading it as weakness, as avoidance, as something to fill the moment someone gets uncomfortable. But there's a different kind of silence, one chosen, not stumbled into, that operates by entirely different rules. This is the silence of someone who simply declines to defend themselves against a judgment that was never accurate to begin with. Not because they have nothing to say, because they understand finally that explaining yourself to someone determined to misread you doesn't produce understanding. It just produces more material for the misreading to feed on. Lao Tzu wrote that those who know don't need to prove it, and those constantly proving it usually don't fully know yet, a line that lands differently once you've watched it play out in real life. Picture a man falsely accused of being cold by a family member who built an entire narrative around old resentment. For years, he defended himself, explained his intentions, provided context. None of it moved the narrative an inch, because the narrative was never built from evidence in the first place. It was built from the other person's own unprocessed hurt. The year he finally stopped explaining wasn't the year he stopped caring. It was the year he understood that some judgments aren't open to revision, no matter what gets presented as defense, and continuing to argue only confirmed in the accuser's mind that the accusation had landed somewhere real. This is the part that separates silence as power from silence as collapse. Power keeps the inner world steady while staying quiet on the outside. Collapse goes quiet because there's nothing left to offer. The difference shows up in the body. One feels like ground beneath the feet. The other feels like a held breath waiting to be released. Marcus Aurelius treated this distinction as a daily discipline, training himself to withhold response, not out of indifference, but because he understood that his peace of mind was not a resource to be spent proving his worth to people who had already decided not to see it. Try this the next time someone offers a judgment that doesn't fit who you actually are. Let it sit there, unanswered, for a full breath longer than feels comfortable. Notice what happens in that gap. Often, it's not weakness that surfaces, it's a kind of quiet authority. The realization that your center doesn't actually require anyone else's verdict to remain intact. That single pause, repeated enough times, starts to feel less like restraint and more like sovereignty. The simple, undramatic refusal to hand your piece over to a courtroom that was never qualified to judge the case in the first place. There's a quiet, often unspoken fear underneath the whole pursuit of being understood. The fear that if nobody truly sees you, maybe you don't fully exist. That fear drives an enormous amount of human behavior, the careful curation of how things look, the constant calibration of how words might land. the exhausting vigilance of managing everyone else's read on who you are. And then, at some point, usually after enough of the work covered in every topic before this one, something shifts. Being misunderstood stops feeling like a wound and starts feeling like proof of something else entirely, that you've finally become someone too specific, too whole, too unwilling to shrink, to fit neatly into the categories other people use to feel comfortable around you. This is the part almost nobody warns you about on the way there. Real freedom rarely arrives wrapped in applause. Often it arrives quietly, almost anticlimactically, in a moment where someone misjudges you completely and the old reflex to correct them simply doesn't fire anymore. Not because you've gone numb, because the verdict no longer holds the authority it once did. The Bhagavad Gita describes this state as a kind of steady action without attachment to outcome, doing what's true, offering what's honest, and releasing any grip on how it gets received by minds that were never going to see the full picture anyway. Think of someone who spends a decade chasing recognition in their field, promotions, praise, public validation, only to discover that none of it ever produces the internal settledness it promised. Then, almost by accident, they build something quieter, a body of work, a relationship, a daily practice, done without an audience watching, done simply because it's true to who they are. That quieter thing, built without performance, tends to outlast everything built for approval. Approval is borrowed. It has to be renewed constantly, refinanced with every new audience. What's built from authenticity doesn't need refinancing. It already belongs to you. This is where the real invitation sits, not in becoming someone impressive enough to finally earn understanding from everyone watching, in becoming someone real enough that understanding stops being the prerequisite for peace. The mask served its purpose once. The shadow held what couldn't be carried in the light yet. The silence protected what didn't need defending. And somewhere underneath all of it, something has been quietly waiting this entire time. Not for permission, not for applause, just for the moment you finally stop asking everyone else what they see and start trusting what you already know to be true.